There is someone in your life right now who already understands more about you than you realize. They know the small details you never openly talk about, the way you behave when you are under pressure, the patterns in your silence, the shifts in your energy when something is bothering you, even if you never say a word about it. And yet, they are still there, still consistent, still present, still quietly close, in a way that doesn't always demand attention, but somehow never truly disappears. But here is the part most people completely miss. You may have been overlooking them this entire time, not because they are unimportant and not because they lack value, but because they never tried to force their presence into your awareness. They didn't compete for your attention. They didn't create drama to be noticed. They simply stayed steady in the background of your life. And that is exactly why they are easy to ignore. Most people believe that if something meaningful is happening, it will feel obvious. It will be loud, emotional, direct, impossible to miss. But real emotional connection rarely works that way. Sometimes it builds in silence, through familiarity, through repeated moments that seem ordinary at first, but slowly start to carry emotional weight. And the strange truth is this: the people who affect you the most deeply are often the ones you notice the least in the beginning. So before you assume that everyone in your life is exactly what they appear to be on the surface, it might be worth looking a little closer, because someone you've been overlooking could already be emotionally closer to you than you ever imagined. Most people grow up believing that attraction follows a clear and predictable formula. You are taught that it depends on appearance, age, timing, confidence, and social status. That if you get these things right, connection will naturally follow. And if you don't, then nothing meaningful can happen. But real human emotion is far more complex than that. Because attraction is not just about what people see, it is about what they feel when they are around you. And feelings don't follow rules. They don't respect logic, they don't care about perfect conditions, and they don't always align with what someone consciously believes they should feel. This is where most misunderstandings begin. You assume that if someone is interested, it will be obvious: clear signals, strong energy, constant engagement, something you can easily identify and label. But emotional connection is rarely that direct. Sometimes, the strongest bonds form quietly, without any dramatic signs, without constant attention, without obvious expressions. Instead, they develop through emotional safety, through familiarity, through consistency that slowly builds trust over time. And this is what most men completely overlook. They focus on intensity, big emotions, exciting interactions, unpredictable energy, thinking that this is what creates real attraction. But intensity is temporary. It burns fast and fades quickly. What actually lasts is emotional stability, the feeling that someone understands you without needing constant explanation, the sense that you can simply exist around them without pressure or performance. And when someone gives you that feeling consistently, something subtle begins to happen. They stop being just another person in your life and start becoming emotionally significant in ways you don't immediately recognize. That is where real attachment begins, not in chaos, but in calm. There is usually someone in your life who never tries to take center stage, yet somehow remains consistently present. They are not the loudest voice in the room. They are not the person who demands attention or creates situations just to stay relevant in your mind. Instead, they exist in a quieter space, one that is easy to overlook but difficult to replace. At first, you don't think much of it. They are simply there from time to time. A conversation here, a moment there, a presence that feels normal, almost effortless. But something subtle begins to happen over time. Without realizing it, you start to feel more comfortable around them. You don't feel the need to explain yourself too much. You don't feel judged for your silence or your moods. There is a sense of ease that slowly develops in their presence, and that ease is where emotional connection begins. Because connection is not always built through big moments. More often, it is built through repetition, through shared experiences that feel small individually, but meaningful when they accumulate over time. Every conversation that felt natural adds another layer. Every moment of understanding adds another thread. Every interaction where you felt normal rather than analyzed or pressured, becomes part of a larger emotional pattern. And this is where most people miss the truth. They assume emotional attachment is supposed to look obvious. They expect signs that are easy to identify, clear expressions, strong reactions, or direct communication. But in reality, deep connection often grows in silence. The silent observer in your life is not silent because they feel nothing. In many cases, it is the opposite. They are silent because they are observing carefully, learning who you are through consistency rather than assumption. They begin to understand your habits, your reactions, your emotional rhythm, the way you behave when things are good and when things are not. And over time, that understanding creates familiarity. Familiarity creates comfort, and comfort creates attachment. But because nothing dramatic happens, you may not notice it forming. There is no sudden moment that tells you something has changed. No clear event that signals emotional depth has developed. Just a steady presence that never fully disappears. And that is exactly why it goes unnoticed until much later, when you finally realize that someone who never demanded your attention may have already earned a deeper place in your emotional world than you ever gave them credit for. The biggest reason most people miss emotional attachment is not because it isn't there, but because it doesn't look the way they expect it to look. You are trained to recognize intensity, not consistency. So your attention naturally goes toward what feels exciting, the person who communicates unpredictably, the one whose energy shifts dramatically, the one who creates emotional highs and keeps you guessing, because those patterns feel significant in the moment. But emotional depth doesn't always behave like that. In many cases, the strongest connection is the one that feels the most normal, and that is exactly why it goes unnoticed. There may be someone in your life who has been emotionally consistent for a long time. They don't overwhelm you with attention. They don't disappear and reappear to trigger your curiosity. They don't create emotional chaos to stay memorable. Instead, they remain steady. They show up in simple ways. They listen more than they speak. They remember things you casually mention. They respond in ways that feel calm, not overwhelming. And because of that calmness, you assume there is nothing deeper happening. But emotional attachment doesn't require noise. It builds quietly through familiarity, through repeated interactions that slowly shape how safe and understood someone feels around you. Over time, that consistency becomes something powerful, not because it is dramatic, but because it is reliable. And reliability is something the human mind begins to trust deeply, even without conscious awareness. This is where most people make a critical mistake. They ignore stability because it doesn't feel exciting enough in the moment. They overlook calm presence because it doesn't trigger emotional urgency. But later, when they reflect, they realize something important. The person they thought was just there was actually one of the most consistent emotional presences in their life. And consistency, once established over time, is not easy to replace. That is why you didn't notice it, because you were never taught to look for quiet emotional signals, only loud ones. And by the time you recognize the difference, the connection has already been forming for far longer than you imagined. Emotional connection does not appear suddenly. It evolves slowly, step by step, often without either person realizing the exact moment it begins to change. At first, it is nothing more than basic interest, a sense of curiosity, a comfortable interaction, a feeling that someone is easy to talk to and doesn't require effort to understand. Then, something subtle shifts. The conversations become more natural. The silences don't feel awkward anymore. There is less need to impress, less pressure to perform, and more space to simply exist as you are. That is where comfort begins. And comfort is the first real foundation of attachment. Because when someone starts feeling emotionally comfortable around you, their mind begins to associate your presence with safety, with ease, with familiarity, and that association grows quietly in the background. Without planning it, they begin to notice your patterns, how you respond when you are stressed, how you behave when you are relaxed, how your energy changes depending on the situation. Over time, you stop being just another person in their life. You become a reference point, a stable emotional experience their mind recognizes and returns to. And this is where the shift becomes deeper. Because once someone associates you with emotional stability, Their connection to you is no longer based on momentary excitement. It becomes something more internal, more rooted, more consistent. Even when there is no conversation happening, your presence still lingers in their mind in a subtle way. Not as an obsession, but as familiarity, as something their emotional world has adjusted to. This is also where comparison quietly begins, not in an obvious or intentional way, but naturally. Other people may come and go, new interactions may happen, but their mind starts measuring those experiences against the emotional standard they already associate with you. And that standard becomes difficult to replace because you didn't create impact through intensity, you created impact through consistency. And consistency builds memory in a way excitement never can. So, what feels like a normal connection from your side may actually be something far more developed on the other side. Not loud, not dramatic, but slowly becoming emotionally significant in a way that is hard to reverse once it has fully formed. One of the most misunderstood stages of emotional connection is silence. People assume that if something real is developing, it will eventually be spoken, that feelings will naturally turn into clear words, that someone will reach a point where they can no longer hold it back. But in reality, it often doesn't happen that way because silence is not always a lack of emotion. In many cases, it is a form of emotional control. When someone begins to feel something deeper, they also become aware of the risks that come with expressing it too early. They start thinking about what could change, what could be lost, what could become uncomfortable if the dynamic shifts. So instead of speaking, they pause. Instead of expressing, they observe. Instead of risking clarity, they protect the connection by keeping it unspoken. And from the outside, this can be very difficult to recognize because nothing seems to change on the surface. The conversations still feel normal. The presence is still there. The behavior remains consistent. There are no dramatic signals or obvious confessions. But internally, something very different is happening. The feelings are still growing, but they are being contained. This creates a unique emotional tension. On one side, there is the desire to connect more deeply, to understand where things are going, and to express what is being felt. On the other side, there is fear. Fear of rejection, fear of misunderstanding, fear of losing access to the connection entirely. So the person stays in a controlled emotional state. They regulate how much they show. They adjust their behavior carefully. They remain present, but not fully exposed. And because of this balance, the connection becomes even more subtle. It exists in gestures instead of words, in consistency instead of confession, in presence instead of explanation. This is why silence can be so misleading. To one person, it feels like nothing is happening. But to the other, everything is happening internally. And the longer this phase continues, the deeper the emotional bond can become, without either side fully acknowledging how strong it has already grown. At some point, emotional patterns stop feeling random. What once seemed like ordinary interactions begins to form a clearer picture. You start noticing consistency where you once saw coincidence. You recognize presence where you previously assumed it was casual. And slowly, the way you interpret certain people in your life begins to change. This is the stage where awareness starts to develop. Not in a dramatic way, but in quiet reflection. You may realize that there has been someone who didn't fade away like others did, someone who didn't require constant attention to remain present, someone who continued to show up in subtle, consistent ways even when nothing significant was happening. And that realization can feel surprising because it forces you to rethink what you assumed about them. What you thought was casual may actually have been consistent care. What you labeled as normal presence may have carried more emotional weight than you initially understood. At this point, the question is no longer whether a connection exists. The question becomes how long it has actually been forming. And that is where clarity becomes unavoidable. Because once you begin to see emotional consistency, you cannot unsee it. You start connecting moments in your memory that didn't seem important at the time. Small interactions begin to feel more meaningful in hindsight. Patterns begin to stand out that were always there. You just didn't focus on them. This is how emotional awareness shifts, not through new information, but through a new perspective on old experiences. And often, This realization brings a subtle emotional tension because you begin to understand that connection is not always created in big moments. Sometimes it is built quietly over time, through presence that never demanded recognition, and by the time you finally notice it, it may have already become a stable part of your emotional landscape, not loud, not obvious, but undeniably real in ways you can no longer ignore. Not every connection in your life announces itself in obvious ways. Some people will never express what they feel directly. Some bonds will never come with clear statements or dramatic moments. And some of the strongest emotional connections you will ever experience will exist quietly without ever being fully spoken out loud. That is why awareness matters, because it is easy to misunderstand consistency as something ordinary. It is easy to confuse emotional stability with lack of interest, and it is easy to overlook people who do not demand attention, even if they are deeply present in your life. But presence has meaning, consistency has weight, and time reveals emotional depth in ways that intensity never can. So instead of only focusing on what feels exciting or obvious, it is worth also noticing what feels steady. The people who don't disappear, the ones who stay connected in small but meaningful ways, the ones who understand you without needing constant explanation. Because sometimes the most important connections are not the ones that demand attention, but the ones that quietly earn it. And by the time you realize their value, they may have already been part of your life in a deeper way than you ever consciously acknowledged. So the real question is not whether emotional connection exists around you. The real question is whether you are paying enough attention to recognize it while it is still unfolding. Because not everyone who matters will tell you, and not every connection will wait forever to be noticed. There is a final truth that most people only understand when it is already too late to change anything. Emotional connection is rarely created in one dramatic moment. It is built slowly through time, repetition, and shared presence that feels ordinary while it is happening. And because it feels ordinary, it is often ignored. People assume that important connections will always announce themselves, that if someone truly matters, it will be obvious, clear, easy to identify. But real emotional bonds don't always work that way. Sometimes the most meaningful connection in your life is the one that never tried to impress you, the one that didn't compete for your attention, the one that simply stayed consistent while you were focused elsewhere. And only later do you realize what that consistency meant. Because when someone is present through your highs and lows, your silence and your changes, your good moments and your uncertain ones, they begin to occupy a space in your emotional world that is not easily replaced, not because of intensity, but because of familiarity. And familiarity creates attachment in a way most people underestimate. So the real lesson is simple, but powerful. Pay attention to the people who remain steady in your life. Not just the ones who excite you, not just the ones who are loud or unpredictable, but the ones who quietly stay. Because sometimes the strongest emotional connections are not the ones you chase. They are the ones you slowly realize were already there all along. There comes a moment in life when things that once felt unclear suddenly start to make sense. Not because anything new appears, but because your awareness changes. You begin to look back at conversations, interactions, and small moments that didn't seem significant at the time. And now they feel different, more meaningful, more connected, more intentional than you originally realized. This is how understanding develops, not through sudden revelation, but through reflection. And in that reflection, one truth often becomes clear. Some people were never as casual in your life as you assumed. They were present in ways you didn't fully recognize. They showed consistency when others didn't. They stayed steady when things were uncertain. And they remained emotionally close in ways that were easy to overlook in the moment. But now you see it differently, not as something loud or dramatic, but as something quiet and steady that slowly built meaning over time. And that realization can be powerful because it shifts how you understand connection itself. It teaches you that emotional depth is not always expressed, that presence does not always announce itself, and that some of the most meaningful bonds in your life may not have started with attention, but with familiarity. So as you move forward, The real lesson is this: pay closer attention to consistency. Because what feels normal today might be something emotionally significant tomorrow, and what feels small right now might already be shaping a deeper connection than you ever realized. Sometimes you don't discover emotional truth when it begins. You discover it when you finally learn how to see it.